The US Army has a long and complicated history when it comes to light tanks. They tend to either go too light on the armor and gun, or too heavy, and they fail to find that Goldilocks zone. In the late 1950s, the Army decided that troops needed a new light tank, one that could be dropped out of an airplane beside airborne troops and go toe-to-toe with the enemy, specifically Soviet armor, including their main battle tanks. They wanted a big gun and light armor, and what they got was either brilliant, terrible, or both, depending on who you ask. It had aluminum, yes, aluminum armor, a giant 152mm gun that also launched a missile called the Shillelagh, which was made by Ford, and a lot of problems. We, of course, are talking about the M551 Sheridan. So today we are telling the story of America's airdroppable tank and how, despite its failings, it served in several wars and did something that we haven't been able to do since, despite decades and billions of dollars of trying. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Army's airborne units had a problem. The 82nd and 101st could drop entire brigades into a war zone, but the biggest thing they had to deal with enemy tanks or hardened positions was a Jeep-mounted recoilless rifle. The Army experimented with stopgaps like the M56 Scorpion. It was basically a 90mm cannon welded to a tiny open chassis, and as you can see, it offered very little protection. Then somebody came up with the M50 Ontos. Few weapons capture the fever dream of the 1950s and 60s defense industry quite like the Ontos. This bizarre contraption strapped 6 106mm recoilless rifles to a tracked vehicle. In Greek, Ontos means things, so they got that right at least. It was great for blasting bunkers and even has a few tank kills to its name, but it was pretty terrible at keeping the crews alive, and believe it or not, crews value that pretty highly. So the Army canceled it, but the Marine Corps, as is tradition, said hell yeah and decided to field it. The Army wanted and needed something different. They wanted something that could go up against Soviet T-62s, which in the 1960s was their premier main battle tank, but they also wanted it to be able to float across rivers, survive a parachute drop, and do all of that while weighing less than 17 tons. Typically, when you design an armored vehicle, you can have mobility, which means it will be light, survivability, which means it needs heavy armor, or you can have firepower, which means it will have a big gun. The trick is that you usually only get to pick two, but the Army wanted all three, and anything that tries to do all three tends to end up like the Sheridan. That isn't to say that it was not an incredible piece of equipment, all things considered, but as we are about to explain, it just wasn't really great at anything. Let's first talk about how this thing was designed, and just so we are clear, we are not dogging on the engineers at all here. What they were asked to do was basically to cheat physics, and what they created was pretty incredible given the technology of the time. Anyway, the prime directive here was to keep the weight low enough for a parachute to have a fighting chance of delivering it to the ground in one piece. So designers built the entire hull out of aluminum, specifically 7039 alloy, which was pretty popular to use for armored vehicles during the 1960s and can be found on early LAVs, later Mike 113s, and of course the Sheridan. Today, many of our armored vehicles, like MRAPs for instance, use aluminum alloys, with MRAPs employing 2139 alloy in blast plates and the up armor kits. There is a lot that goes into armor, and I honestly spent way too much time digging into this as I write this on a Sunday, and yes, I'm leaving this in the script for future me to read, but essentially things like plate size, weldability, and corrosion resistance are major factors in these decisions, and where we are now with alloys is far beyond where we were in the 1960s. Of course, the threats facing armor today are also much more lethal, and I could honestly talk a lot more about this because it is genuinely interesting, but I won't because I don't want to put you all to sleep, but I will drop a link into the description of something that I really had fun reading, so go check that out if you're curious. Alright, so we know that aluminum kept it light and helped solve for the mobility problem, but aluminum at that point wasn't known for stopping things like heavy machine guns, RPGs, or landmines, let alone a main battle tank's cannon. Crews in Vietnam, and we are getting into its role in that war in a few minutes, would later describe it as a tank that hated being shot at, which, technically speaking, is not great. Besides the weight, the tank also had to have a gun capable of killing other tanks, so the designers went with the 152mm Mike 81 gun launcher. Instead of the standard 90mm or 105mm tank guns of the era, the Army picked a giant, low-velocity cannon specifically designed to fire both conventional high-explosive rounds and a guided anti-tank missile called the M51 Shillelagh, which, as we mentioned, was built by Ford. The idea and the hope was that paratroopers could drop in behind enemy lines and still knock out T-62 tanks from several kilometers away. The M81 was lightweight at about 1,080 pounds compared to the 2,800 pounds for the 105mm Mike 68 that was found on the M48 and M60 Patton tanks. So not only did designers get a much more powerful gun, but they also saved some weight. Everybody wins. This is the part where you're probably picking up on a sense of foreboding, and you're right. On paper, this combo of an aluminum hull and a powerful main gun solved several problems that airborne units had, but despite what many leaders may think, wars are not fought on paper. In reality, firing the 152mm gun created so much shock and recoil that the lightweight tank just couldn't absorb it well, and it regularly damaged itself. The blast could break sights, crack components, and rattle electronics right off the mounts. There are crew reports of headlights literally falling off when they sent a round downrange. The Shillelagh, meanwhile, was ahead of its time, just not in a good way. It relied on sensitive infrared guidance electronics that were constantly rattled, shaken, and jarred by the tank's enormous recoil. Even when the systems worked, the missile demanded a kind of pristine field environment that battlefields just typically do not offer. And remember how they wanted this to float? To do that, they came up with a flotation gear that was basically a giant canvas screen that crews could unfold around the hull so the Sheridan could swim. It's a lot like what we see on the M4 Shermans that were used at Normandy. In practice, just like in Normandy, the flotation screen was pretty flimsy and time-consuming to deploy, so almost nobody used it outside of demonstrations. Even with these issues, the Sheridan entered service with its 4-man crew in 1967 because nothing else came close to meeting the Army's contradictory wish list, and we needed something quick because Vietnam was heating up and our Patton tanks just were not well suited for the rice paddies and jungles. The Sheridan first deployed to Vietnam in January of 1969 despite entering service in 1967 because we just didn't have enough 152mm shells ready to go until 1969. Leaders like General Abrams, whose name should absolutely be familiar to you because the Abrams tank is named after him, also didn't know how to use the new tank or even who would get them. So they decided to test it in country with the 3rd Squadron of the 4th Cavalry Regiment and the 1st Squadron of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. By 1970, there were more than 200 Sheridans in Vietnam, along with factory representatives, instructors, and evaluators, because troops had never really seen them before. We complain a lot about decisions that leaders make today, and they still make some pretty boneheaded decisions, but this one is pretty bad. Despite having the worst possible situation, the soldiers and the Sheridan performed relatively well, especially if you're grading on a curve. If you expected the Sheridan to behave like a mini main battle tank, it seemed like a failure, but if you treated it as a highly mobile fire support vehicle, it suddenly made a lot of sense. The 152mm high explosive round turned out to be devastating. Soldiers used Sheridans to blast bunkers, rip through tree lines, and break up ambushes. The tank's lightweight design also allowed it to operate in terrain that bogged down heavier armor. In certain kind of fights, especially short-range engagements against Duggan infantry like was pretty common in Vietnam, the Sheridan was extremely effective. but the weaknesses were obvious. The aluminum armor didn't stop much. RPGs could penetrate easily, and mines tore through the belly and often caused catastrophic fires, and the ammunition storage and fuel cells were vulnerable. Crews responded the same way that troops always have when they get handed an absolute shit sandwich. They improvised. Like with Humvees during early Operation Iraqi Freedom, troops added extra armor plates, they stacked sandbags, and they filled every gap with anything that could stop a flying hot piece of metal. As for the Shillelagh missile, it was never fired in combat in Vietnam because jungles are one of the worst possible environments for a delicate, line-of-sight guided missile system. Humidity corroded electronics, dust clogged optics, and maintaining the launcher in the bush was just a losing battle. So in Vietnam, the Sheridan wasn't a tank killer because, honestly, there just weren't many tanks at all to be killed, but it was a fast, loud, and useful fire support vehicle, one that soldiers relied on more than its reputation might suggest. So, in typical fashion, troops took a shit sandwich that they were being force-fed, and they made it palatable. Sheridans would remain in the country until the last US combat troops left, but overall, nobody was really impressed with it, and most soldiers still preferred the Patton tanks. So, with that conflict ended, but the Cold War still raging, leaders now wanted to find out if it could face the Soviets. When the program started in the late 1950s, the jungles of Vietnam were not really a part of the equation, but knocking out Soviet armor in Europe very much was, and decisions were made with this in mind. This is where the contradictions become impossible to ignore. A major aspect of the Sheridan was the Shillelagh missile. It was the reason they went with a gun launcher and not a traditional cannon, and in clean test ranges in the United States, the Shillelagh actually worked. But field conditions were rarely clean, and reliability remained a problem throughout the vehicle's life. Despite having a cool and fun-to-say name, the Shillelagh just was not ready for combat. The 152mm shells weren't much help either. They lacked the velocity to punch through serious armor, and accuracy fell off once you got beyond a few hundred meters. They were also slow to load and highly combustible. For perspective, a well-trained M48 crew could put out upwards of 17 rounds in a mad minute, while a Sheridan could only muster about 2. Add all that to the fact that it could only carry 20 152mm shells and 9 missiles, and you can see where this might not succeed at facing hordes of Soviet tanks barreling through the Fulda Gap. So the missile was all but worthless. The main gun had to get close to do any damage, and you pretty much had to score a direct kill shot on the first hit because it was going to be a while before another could be sent, and the thin armor wasn't going to stop any return fire. So at this point, the Army decided to end this experiment and cancel the Sheridan. Psych, the Army kept the Sheridan because it couldn't afford to get rid of it. Does that sound familiar to anybody else? If that doesn't sound familiar to anybody else, this next part certainly will. Every intended replacement program either ballooned in cost, grew too heavy to be airdropped, or fell apart due to shifting priorities. The Army's needs did not disappear, but development money did, so they kept the Sheridan around. Now, this wasn't the worst call, with hindsight being 2020, and it would soon fill an important role in not one, but 2 conflicts. When the United States invaded Panama in December of 1989 as part of Operation Just Cause, the Sheridan was finally dropped from the air. That brief conflict presented a sudden need to cover a lot of ground and deliver close-in fire support. Commanders and troops actually loved having the Sheridan. They noticed that it was hugely effective against fortifications and provided a psychological blow to the enemy, who seemed to fear tanks as most logical people do. So finally, after 20 plus years of trying to find a job, Just Cause provided it, but it would be the tank's high watermark. In Desert Storm in 1991, the 82nd Airborne deployed Sheridans mainly as reconnaissance and direct fire support vehicles. Nobody expected them to face Iraqi T-72s head-on. Instead, they served as mobile gun platforms for screening operations, security missions, and fire support for light infantry. But they didn't really see much use thanks to the Bradleys and the Abrams taking the bulk of the combat duties, but they did finally fire as many as 6 Shillelaghs, so that's pretty cool. And then after Desert Storm, the Sheridan began a strange second life at the National Training Center in Fort Irwin. Here, the vehicle actually became a star, serving as OPFOR, or the opposing force, simulating Soviet armor. Its small size, mobility, and cheap operating costs made it perfect for that role. Ironically, the Sheridan may have contributed more to US combat readiness as an enemy surrogate than as a US tank. It was finally retired in 1997 with no replacement. The program to replace it, the M8 Armored Gun System, was cancelled the year prior. The M8 was designed specifically to fix everything wrong with the Sheridan. It had a better gun, better armor, modular protection levels, and full airdrop capability. With the fall of the Soviet Union, though, Congress just didn't see a need to spend all that money, but the need for a light tank remained. After that came the Stryker Mobile Gun System in 2002. It used a proven 105mm cannon, but it wasn't airdroppable, it also struggled with recoil forces, and it wasn't suited to heavy direct firefights. So that was retired in 2022. The latest attempt, the Mobile Protected Firepower Vehicle, which became the M10 Booker, was supposed to give airborne brigades a modern light tank, even if they didn't want to call it that. But as we all know, that too was cancelled. Which leaves the Army right back where it started. Airborne units today rely on weapons like Javelin missiles, drones, and heavier vehicles that show up later by airlift. The US still has no true airdroppable tank, and the problem the Sheridan was built to solve remains unsolved, and honestly probably never will be. So what do we make of the Sheridan today? It was flawed, it was vulnerable, it was over-engineered in some places and underbuilt in others, and the gun launcher system was a constant headache. But it was also daring. It provided light units with firepower they otherwise would not have had. In Vietnam, it saved lives. In Panama, it helped take down strongpoints. At NTC, it trained generations of armored crews. And in all the decades since, the US has never fielded anything that does what the Sheridan did, even if it did most of it poorly. So the Sheridan's legacy isn't that it failed, it's that it tried to do something hard, and the Army has still not found a better way to do it. So let us know what you think about the Sheridan in the comments, and if there's any other older military vehicles or planes, basically anything older that you want us to do some deep dives in and give a little history on, let us know, because I genuinely enjoy doing this research into them. It's fun, it's lighthearted, there's a lot of stuff going on. This was kind of a nice break. So let us know what you think in the comments, and subscribe, do all that stuff that I always forget to ask you to do. Alright, now it's channel update time, and I wrote this script and Savvy edited the video. I don't have a whole lot. I'll give my email out as I always do, kyle.gunn@taskandpurpose.com. You can email me corrections to videos. So if I make a big mistake, go ahead, put corrections in the subject line, shoot me an email, I'll address it in the channel update section at the end of the next video I record. That way we get correct information out there and we hold ourselves accountable. If you just need to talk to somebody, you can email me there too. I'm still always keeping up with the emails, so if I don't respond, I'm sorry, I will get to it. It just might be a month or two after. I apologize. Anyways, that's all I got. I am Kyle, your friendly ginger producer man. You are all dismissed. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you next time.